Sperry and Hutchinson, S and H green stamps. For millions of Americans in the mid-20th century, these words weren't just a brand. They were a promise, a tiny, perforated green and white promise. You didn't buy things with them. You earned them, accumulating them slowly, patiently, with every gallon of gas, every carton of milk, every pound of ground beef. Each stamp was a small deposit in the bank of delayed gratification. They were the currency of housewives, the treasure of the working man, a tangible representation of the American dream, paid for on the installment plan of daily life. And in the sleepy Texas town of Prairie Creek, in the summer of 1974, that dream was about to turn into a nightmare. Prairie Creek was a town where time seemed to have forgotten to move forward. A single traffic light blinked lazily over the intersection of Main Street and Elm, its authority largely symbolic. The air hung thick with the sweet smell of freshly cut hay from the surrounding fields and the faint, dusty scent of cattle. The heart of this town, its social and commercial center, was Abernathy's General Mercantile. For 40 years, Arthur Abernathy had been more than a grocer. He was a confidant, a banker of small favors, and the keeper of the town's collective memory. His store was a cathedral of comforts, with its creaking wooden floors dusted with sawdust, shelves stacked high with canned peaches and sacks of flour, and a humming Coca-Cola cooler that wept cold beads of condensation onto the floor. On the morning of July 12, 1974, that comforting world was shattered. It was young Timmy, the paper boy, who found him. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual, but not unheard of. Mr. Abernathy often came in before dawn, but the silence inside was heavy, unnatural. "Mr. Abernathy?" Timmy called out, his voice swallowed by the cavernous space. He walked past the tidy aisles towards the back office, where a sliver of light shone from under the door. He pushed it open, and a small scream caught in his throat. Arthur Abernathy, 72 years old, lay on the floor by his heavy oak desk, a dark, unnatural stain blooming on the worn linoleum around his head. Sheriff Brody arrived within minutes, his Ford pickup kicking up a cloud of dust. Frank Brody was a man carved from the same Texas landscape he patrolled, weathered, pragmatic, and not easily surprised. But this surprised him. He knelt by his old friend, his face a mask of grim professionalism. The scene was confusing. The cash register up front was untouched, still holding yesterday's earnings. The safe in the office was closed and locked. Abernathy's wallet, with $63 inside, was still in his back pocket. It wasn't a robbery. So, what was it? Brody's eyes scanned the cluttered office, stacks of invoices, a rotary phone, a half-finished cup of coffee. Then he saw it. The large metal lockbox on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, the one everyone in town knew about, was open, and it was empty. The only thing missing was Arthur Abernathy's personal collection of filled S and H green stamp books. Dozens and dozens of them, a lifetime of accumulation. Enough, as the man himself used to joke, to furnish a whole new house from the S and H catalog. A life had been taken, not for cash, but for a box of sticky green paper. The investigation began, as it always did in Prairie Creek, with coffee and conversation. Sheriff Brody set up a makeshift command post at a corner table in the town diner, the institutional white coffee mugs forming a perimeter around his notepad. The news had spread through the town's invisible network of party line telephones and backyard fence gossip, casting a pall over the morning sun. Who could do such a thing, and why? The question hung in the air, thicker than the smell of frying bacon. Abernathy didn't have an enemy in the world. He was the man who extended credit when a farmer had a bad crop, who gave candy to children, whether they had a nickel or not. Brody's young deputy, a fresh-faced kid named Miller, was baffled. "Sheriff, I just don't get it," he said, stirring his coffee. "Stamps? Why not take the cash? It makes no sense." Brody took a long sip, his eyes gazing out at the quiet street. "Miller, you're too young," he said, his voice low. You see those stamps as paper. For Arthur and for a lot of folks of his generation, they were more than that. They were a testament, proof of a life of hard work and thrift. He'd been saving them since the 50s. We're not talking about a new toaster here. Arthur had enough books to get the top-of-the-line console television, a new bedroom set, maybe even that fancy shotgun on page 84 of the catalog. For someone with nothing, those books represented a fortune you couldn't get with cash. The initial forensics were primitive by today's standards. The county medical examiner confirmed Abernathy died from a blunt force trauma to the back of the head. He'd likely been pushed, fell, and struck his head on the corner of his heavy oak desk. It might not have been a premeditated murder, but a dispute that turned fatal. But a dispute over what? The investigators dusted for fingerprints, but the office was a public space, coated in the prints of half the town who'd come in over the years to settle accounts or share a story. Brody and Miller interviewed everyone who had been in the store the previous day. The baker who delivered bread, the ranchers who picked up supplies, the housewives who did their daily shopping. They were met with a wall of genuine shock and grief. No one saw anything unusual. No one heard an argument. Arthur was his usual cheerful self. The case was as cold as the tile floor in the morgue. The killer had vanished, leaving behind a dead man and a ghost of a motive printed in green ink on perforated sheets. The investigation stalled, and for weeks the only sound in Sheriff Brody's office was the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, stirring the stale, unanswered questions. Weeks turned into a month. The summer heat pressed down on Prairie Creek, baking the sorrow into the very asphalt of Main Street. The Abernathy case had become a town myth, a sad story told in hushed tones. Sheriff Brody felt the weight of it every day. It was a personal failure, a broken promise to a dead friend. He'd exhausted every lead. He'd driven out to every farm and ranch within a 50-mile radius, asking the same questions until his voice was hoarse and the faces of the people he spoke to blurred into one. The trail had gone completely cold. He was sitting in his office staring at the case file, the crime scene photos of the empty lockbox mocking him, when the phone rang. Its shrill, piercing sound was an intrusion, a jolt of electricity in the stagnant air. "Sheriff Brody," he answered, his voice flat with routine. On the other end was a man named Henderson, the manager of the S&H Green Stamps Redemption Center in Dallas, 100 miles away. "Sheriff," the man began, his voice tinny over the long-distance line, "I'm calling about that bulletin you sent out a few weeks back, about a large quantity of stolen stamp books." Brody sat bolt upright in his chair, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "Yes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Well," Henderson continued, "it was a long shot, but your bulletin mentioned the amount was substantial. And 2 days ago, a fellow came in here, redeemed an enormous number of books, an unusual amount, enough that I remembered your flyer." This was it, the break. "Can you describe him?" Brody asked, grabbing a pen, his knuckles white. "Average fellow," Henderson said. "Maybe late 30s, looked like a farmer or a ranch hand. Calloused hands, sun-weathered face, quiet type, didn't say much." It was a description that could fit half the men in Prairie Creek's county. "Anything else?" "Anything at all?" Brody pressed. Henderson paused, thinking. He was in a hurry, seemed nervous, and he had a tattoo on his right forearm. Strange one, looked homemade. A bird of some kind, maybe an eagle, but not a professional job. Kinda crude. Brody's pen scratched furiously. He redeemed the stamps for a Winchester shotgun, the deluxe model, and a full set of high-end fishing gear. The total came to just over what the stamps were worth, and he paid the small overage, about $5, with a crumpled bill he pulled from his pocket. Brody held his breath. "Did you notice anything about the bill?" Henderson thought for a moment. "You know, I think I do. I remember smoothing it out to put in the register. It had a stamp on it, one of those little ink stamp businesses use." Prairie Creek Feed and Seed. It stuck in my mind because you don't see small-town names like that much in the city. Brody thanked the man profusely and hung up the phone. He finally had a trail. It wasn't made of footprints or tire tracks, but of a crude tattoo and a $5 bill. In the quiet Texas town, the hunt for the green stamp ghost was on again. A single crumpled bill, a faded ink stamp. It wasn't much, but for Sheriff Brody, it was a lighthouse in a storm. The Prairie Creek Feed and Seed was more than just a store. It was a social institution for the men who worked the land. The air inside was a potent cocktail of fertilizer, leather, and sweet molasses-based feed. Brody walked in, the bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt out of place with the gravity of his mission. Old Man Hemphill, the proprietor, looked up from behind the counter, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Frank," he grunted, "if you're here about my tab at the diner, tell him the check's in the mail." Brody managed a weak smile. "Not today, Earl. I'm on business." He explained the situation, leaving out the part about the murder. He just said he was looking for a man who might have been in Dallas recently. He focused on the key detail. "I'm looking for someone with a tattoo on his forearm. A bird, maybe an eagle. Looks homemade." Hemphill squinted, stroking his chin. The men of Prairie Creek were not the type for decorative ink. Tattoos were for sailors or ex-convicts, not God-fearing farmers. "A homemade tattoo, an eagle," he murmured, his gaze drifting towards the sacks of grain stacked against the wall, as if the answer might be written on them. A couple of ranchers loitering by the counter, nursing lukewarm sodas, shook their heads. The name didn't ring a bell. Brody felt a familiar wave of frustration. The description was too vague, the town too full of quiet men who kept to themselves. He was about to leave when a young man, barely 20, who had been silently loading sacks of feed onto a dolly, spoke up. "Sheriff," he said shyly, "I think I might know who you mean." All eyes turned to him. "Works out at the Miller place, west of town. David Miller. He's a quiet fellow, keeps to himself, but I've seen him loading hay in the summer with his sleeves rolled up. He's got a tattoo on his arm, just like you said. An eagle. My granddad said he did it himself with a needle and some ink when he was a teenager." The name hit Brody with the force of a physical blow. David Miller. He knew the name, but not the man. He was a farmhand, married to a sweet woman named Sarah, who sometimes sang in the church choir. They lived in a small rented house on the edge of the old Johnson Ranch. They were poor, but by all accounts, hard-working and honest. Brody's mind reeled. It couldn't be him. David Miller was the kind of man you'd trust with your last dollar, not someone who would kill an old man for a box of stamps. But the pieces fit. A quiet man, a man with calloused hands, a man with a crude homemade tattoo of an eagle. Brody thanked the boy and walked out into the oppressive heat. The trail was no longer cold. It had a name, and it led to a place he never would have suspected. The road to the Miller house was little more than a pair of dirt tracks winding through fields of sun-bleached grass. The house itself was small, a simple wooden structure with a fresh coat of white paint that couldn't quite hide its age. A few healthy-looking tomato plants grew in a small garden out front, and a clean but rusty pickup truck was parked beside it. It was a picture of modest, hard-working life. There was no sign of the high-end shotgun or fancy fishing gear. Sheriff Brody pulled up and killed the engine, the sudden silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. He saw David Miller out by the fence line, mending a stretch of barbed wire. He was a lean man with the kind of wiry strength that comes from a life of physical labor. As Brody approached, Miller looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His movements were calm, his expression open and unconcerned. But as Brody got closer, he saw the man's eyes. They were filled with a deep, weary sadness that went far beyond the heat of the day. and on his right forearm, partially visible beneath a rolled-up sleeve, was the unmistakable shape of a crudely inked bird. "David," Brody said, his voice gentle. "Got a minute?" Miller nodded slowly, his gaze wary. "Sheriff." Brody didn't want to play games. He had a feeling this wasn't a man you could trick or intimidate. He decided to talk about the man David was, not the killer he might be. "Heard things have been tough," Brody began, gesturing vaguely towards the small house. "Heard Sarah's been unwell." At the mention of his wife's name, a flicker of pain crossed David's face. It was the first crack in his stoic facade. The town gossip was right. Sarah Miller had been sick for the better part of a year with a kidney ailment that the local doctor couldn't fix. The trips to specialists in Dallas, the expensive medicines, it was a burden that would have crushed a man with far greater resources than a farmhand's meager wages. Brody could see the story laid out before him now, not in a police report, but in the slump of a good man's shoulders. This wasn't a crime of greed, it was a crime of desperation. Inside the house, through the screen door, Brody could see Sarah sitting in a chair by the window, a quilt over her lap. She looked pale and thin. On a small table next to her was a stack of envelopes, their stark white color and formal return addresses screaming of medical bills and final notices. David followed Brody's gaze, and the fight seemed to drain out of him completely. "She's my whole world, Sheriff," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'd do anything for her." Brody's heart ached. He knew with a terrible certainty that David Miller wasn't lying. He had done anything for her, and now he was going to have to pay the price. The confession didn't come with yelling or denials. It came quietly, reluctantly, like water seeping from a crack in a dam. Sitting at the Warren kitchen table, with the smell of coffee and despair hanging in the air, David Miller told Sheriff Brody the story of that fateful night. It hadn't started with malice. It had started, ironically, with kindness. For weeks, David had been consumed by a quiet, gnawing panic. The medical bills were a mountain, and his wages were a shovel too small to make a dent. He was too proud to ask for charity, but the weight of it was breaking him. One evening, he was in Abernathy's store, buying a few staples on credit he wasn't sure he could ever repay. Seeing the desperation in the young man's eyes, Arthur Abernathy, in his typical gentle fashion, had tried to help. He took David into the back office. He knew of their troubles, he said. He didn't have much cash to spare, but he had something else. He pointed to the metal lockbox. "My green stamps," he'd said with a sad smile. "Been saving them my whole life." "There's enough in there to get some real valuable things, David. A fine shotgun, fancy fishing gear, things you could sell for good money, real cash. I want you to take them. Consider it a loan. Pay me back when Sarah's well and you're back on your feet." David was stunned by the old man's generosity. It was a lifeline. He refused at first, but Abernathy insisted. He told David to come back late that night after he'd closed up to avoid town gossip. So David did. But when he arrived, something had shifted in the old man. Abernathy was holding the open box, looking at the neatly packed books. He'd spent the evening looking through the S&H catalog, perhaps realizing he was giving away not just paper, but his own deferred dreams, a lifetime of small triumphs. "I don't know if I can do this, son," he said, his voice full of regret. This is everything." An argument started, not a loud one, but a tense, desperate one. David, seeing his only hope slipping away, pleaded with him. Abernathy, clinging to his life savings, tried to take the offer back. He turned to put the box away. In a moment of sheer, blind panic, David reached out and grabbed his shoulder. "Please," he'd begged. It wasn't a violent attack, it was a desperate shove. But Abernathy was old and frail. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling. He fell, and the back of his head struck the sharp, unforgiving corner of the heavy oak desk with a sickening crack. He didn't move. David stared in horror, the silence of the room roaring in his ears. He hadn't meant to hurt him. He hadn't meant for any of it. But there he was, a good man, dead on the floor. In a fog of terror, David did the only thing his panicked mind could think of. He grabbed the box of stamps and fled into the night, a killer by accident, a thief by necessity. The evidence was not hidden. It was sitting in plain sight, a monument to a terrible mistake. Sheriff Brody followed David Miller to the small, weathered barn behind the house. Propped against the wall, still in its original box, was the Winchester shotgun, its wood gleaming, its metal untouched by human hands. Beside it, the high-end fishing rod and reel were still wrapped in plastic. These weren't the tools of a sportsman or the liquidated assets of a desperate man. They were trophies of a crime he couldn't bear to look at, symbols of a price that had been far too high. "I couldn't sell them," David said, his voice hollow. "Every time I looked at them, I saw his face. I saw him lying on the floor." He had driven to Dallas in a daze, redeemed the stamps just as he and Abernathy had planned, going through the motions of a future that had already died. He brought the items home and hid them in the barn, as if keeping them out of the house could somehow keep the poison of his deed from infecting his wife, Sarah. But the poison was inside him, eating away at his soul. As Brody placed the handcuffs on David's wrists, the click of the metal was unnaturally loud in the quiet barn. David didn't resist. The fight had left him weeks ago on the floor of Abernathy's office. Sarah appeared at the door of the house, her face a mask of confusion and fear, pulling a thin shawl around her shoulders. She saw the shotgun box, she saw the sheriff, and she saw the handcuffs on her husband's wrists. A slow, devastating understanding dawned in her eyes. She didn't scream or cry out. She just let out a small, wounded sound, the sound of a heart breaking. The ride back to town was silent. Brody drove slowly, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. He wasn't transporting a hardened criminal. He was escorting a decent man whose life had been irrevocably shattered by a single panicked moment. The whole tragedy unspooled in Brody's mind: a sick wife, a mountain of debt, an act of kindness, a moment of doubt, a clumsy shove, and a fatal fall. It was a chain of sorrowful events, each link forged in desperation and bad luck. The justice system would call it manslaughter or second-degree murder. They would have legal names for what happened. But Brody knew that in the quiet court of his own conscience, David Miller had already been tried, convicted, and sentenced to a lifetime of regret long before the law ever found him. The shotgun and the fishing rod would be logged as evidence, but their true significance was symbolic. They were the expensive, useless proof of a man who had lost everything in an attempt to save the one thing he held dear. In the end, it was a crime solved not by modern forensics or brilliant deduction, but by a homemade tattoo and the faint ink stamp of a local feed store. It was a story of its time, rooted in a world that was already beginning to fade. Soon, credit cards would replace thrift, and the patient art of collecting green stamps would become a curious relic of the past, a story grandparents told about a time when you could earn a new bicycle one grocery trip at a time. The town of Prairie Creek mourned Arthur Abernathy, and in their own quiet way, they mourned for David Miller and his wife, Sarah, as well. They were victims of a different sort, caught in the gears of a tragedy that had no true villain. The case of the green stamp ghost was officially closed. The files were put away, and life in the small Texas town slowly returned to its familiar, languid rhythm. But for those who knew the story, the world looked a little different. They understood that desperation could make a good man do a terrible thing, and that a single irreversible mistake could unravel a life stitched together with honest work and good intentions. David Miller wasn't a monster. He was a man drowning in circumstances beyond his control, who reached for a lifeline that tragically became a noose. He had cashed in those stamps, the symbols of another man's entire life of patience and honest labor, to pay for a crime. He had traded a box of green paper promises for a future of concrete walls and barbed wire. The shotgun he bought was never fired. The lures he acquired never touched the water. They were just heavy, useless symbols of a moment of panic, a final, bitter testament to a debt that could never be repaid and a price that was far, far too high to pay.